Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Francesca Favarò, Safety Best Practice Lead Waymo. Francesca, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Grayson.
I'm excited to have you here because from day one, back to the Google self-driving car project to today, now known as Waymo, you've always taken a leadership position on safety, so I can't wait to dive into safety with you today.
Likewise.
Now that you're Waymo, Francesca, how is Waymo approaching safety?
So Waymo has an approach that we call a layer approach to safety, which basically means we look at the combination of three different layers. We start with the architecture, our hardware layer, which is really the base vehicle and all the hardware that powers the Waymo Driver. So the sensors, the compute, and the goals there are building a highly performant, robust, reliable, secure architecture. And then on top of that, you need to look at the behavior layer, which is really the heart and soul of the Waymo Driver, the software that makes sure that once we deploy on the road and we're driving on public roads, our behavior is safe and proficient. But that's not enough. There's a third layer, which is the operations layer. When you look at this technology, the power that it has is that the Waymo Driver as a technology actually allows a consistent learning across an entire fleet. And so the operations layer is where everything starts coming together. And we ensure that going from the Waymo Driver to the Waymo service, we are in fact deploying a safe product in a scalable fleet.
When you mentioned consistent learning, is that perhaps a vehicle's operating in one part of the city and operating in another part of the city, and they're sharing data in real time about something they might have encountered?
Maybe not so much as that. That happens too, but more about learning new things. And that's the reality of artificial intelligence, right? All this training and all this teaching and all the learning gets shared across hundreds and thousands of vehicles. And not even maybe within the same city. Right now we're operating in San Francisco, in downtown Phoenix, and in Chandler. And so the beauty of it is that when you encounter similar situations, then you can learn across the entire fleet.
Very good. How is Waymo's layered approach to safety developed? You mentioned hardware, you mentioned behavior, and operations. Is that what you would call the Waymo framework? How was that developed?
So the safety framework actually is the combination of methodologies that basically allow you to make that determination of safety with regards to architecture, behavior, and operation. And when we look at the development, I think the heart of it is that it started with the realization that no single metric could or would ever suffice. So safety has never been a single number bottom line for Waymo. And so in 2020, and that paper is available to the public at waymo.com/safety, we released this overview of all of the methodologies that lead us to the readiness determination. And that's really the safety framework. Of course, it's implemented through this recognition of the architectural, behavioral, and operational layer. But there's more to it. I think that in that paper, but also when we presented it to the public in multiple conferences, we really look at how you start from a rigorous approach to the development process. And so you have the backbone of systems engineering and system safety practices that exist out there. But what happens is after you look at architecture, behavior, and operations, let's say from a design and development perspective, at certain points in time, you need to make a determination that a certain software release, a new cut, is ready to be deployed on the road. And that actually entails an estimation, an evaluation that happens through this concert of methodologies. While we make that determination of safety, the work actually doesn't stop there. Once the Waymo Driver gets on public roads, we have continuous in-field data monitoring. And that's really the data collection pipeline that allows us to have a continuous confidence build-up that the estimation that we made when we really said, yes, this software release can be deployed, it doesn't pose unreasonable risk for the public. That's really when we are, in fact, making sure that such an estimate had enough accuracy within it. And so far, our track record speaks to it. So when we are doing those estimates, we base them on countless simulation, test track testing, public testing with test drivers, our autonomous specialists. So you probably have seen the numbers, the 20 billion simulations, miles, the 20 million actual miles. But at the end of the day, I think that there is this notion of continuous confidence build-up and continuous iteration within the safety framework. And that's really the reality of why this process has worked for us.
Waymo's been very public with the rigorous testing. You have the facility, which is commonly known as the castle, where you're running all sorts of different tests related to safety. You have the simulation, which you've been very public and open with, and I'll use the word transparent with the public of how you're doing that safety. You published Waymo's safety framework. Does that tie into Waymo's culture of transparency, where you're developing this technology, you're publishing papers, you're publishing videos, so as the public, your riders in your vehicle say, okay, this is how they develop this vehicle?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Waymo is very keen in establishing a partnership with the public, with the rest of the industry. At the end of the day, that's actually the job that I do on a daily basis. I serve as Waymo rep in external working groups, in committees where I engage with people that do the same job I do, but for other companies. And beyond the papers, and yes, in 2020, we released the safety framework, we released data. So I think Waymo did a lot of firsts for the industry, but I think there's also the genuine will to have that connection with the public. The type of approaches like the Let's Talk Autonomous Driving, those type of initiatives, I think really stand out and go a long way, or even just participating in your podcast, right? It's beyond just releasing the paper. It's really trying to make the most out of these type of educational material in a way that can be understood by a broader audience.
And I want to give you credit. When you first launched in Chandler, you brought several members of the Cardinals, the Arizona Cardinals football team, into the local community. And I think it might have been a boys and girls club for those individuals to experience the Waymo experience. And now Waymo, you're on the road to autonomy. No pun intended. It's the name of the podcast as well. You're now expanding into multiple cities. You're expanding into downtown Phoenix. You're operating around the airport as well. And you're also expanding into San Francisco. How is the safety plan evolving as Waymo goes into new cities and further expands its offerings?
I think that we have really a tried and true playbook that got us this far, but we continuously strive to making things more effective. The next big thing is getting this technology to scale. And scaling up really means becoming more efficient in applying our safety evaluation methodology, our safety framework, to multiple cities at the same time. And so I don't want to get too technical, but that's where we are looking at things like the generalization of the operational design domain, the big ODD notion in the technical field. You're basically looking for features across multiple locations that are similar, and so potentially they enable a similar performance. Of course, you still have to test them. And so the good thing about Waymo for me is that we combine that ambition with realism. We've been very forthcoming on the fact that we rely on autonomous specialists or test drivers for a number of missions. And so we start with mapping, we do data collection, then we start the early testing. That's kind of the playbook. And then after that, we go for more advanced testing. Things ramp up into early rider programs, first with our employees and then open to selected public before going commercial. That's what happened in Chandler, is happening in San Francisco, and hopefully is going to happen in many more cities.
I want to give yourself, the Waymo leadership, and the entire company a lot of credit. You don't cut corners. You have a framework. You stick to your framework and you're repeating it city by city. You're not saying, oh, wait a second. Well, let's rush ahead to beat somebody. You're diligently doing the right thing. And I want to give you a lot of credit for that. And I started prepping for this podcast, looking into different sources of data. And one of the data sources I looked into is the Arizona Department of Transportation crash data. Waymo's been operating in Chandler, Arizona, very publicly, fully autonomous since 2020. In 2020, there were 2,813 human car crashes and 3,345 human car crashes in 2021, an increase of 532 crashes. With human car crashes increasing 6.2% year over year, are you updating your safety framework to accommodate for this trend?
It's always sobering to see the stats. And I think that this serves as a moral call to action. And that's why Waymo doesn't cut corners, as you were saying. There's multiple ways in which this type of data can be used and how it informs our safety practices. Beyond the increasing trends, I think that when you look at crash statistics and crash data for a specific location, you can take a look at trends and say that a certain type of crash is becoming more or less frequent. What that does is actually it can guide prioritization and attention given to different methodologies. And that becomes even more extreme as you are approaching expansions of your operational design domain. And so, for example, when we were looking at the expansion into dense urban environment, whether it was the downtown Phoenix or San Francisco, the analysis of the data and the trends really called for in-depth analysis of interactions with vulnerable road users. And so the pedestrians, the cyclists, motorcyclists. And that doesn't mean that we were not doing that before. It simply means that all of a sudden that type of interaction is happening with a lot lower separation. And so what does that entail for your methodologies, and how will the framework continuously improve upon? There's nothing ever perfect in this world, I used to say. So I think that remains true also for any safety evaluation program.
So you have a vulnerable road user, an individual riding a bicycle, for example. Is that a clear example of a road user that you're looking for and developing if you're going in dense urban environments where that bicyclist perhaps might be closer to the vehicle than, say, in Chandler where there might be a divided sidewalk, for example?
Yeah, for sure.
So you have that. And then the other trend that we all experience on a daily basis when we drive human-driven cars is distracted driving. I can't tell you how many times you're at a red light and it turns green and the person's not moving because they're looking at their phone. And there's NHTSA data to back this up, which is frankly very sad. In 2020, distracted driving claimed 3,142 lives. That's sad. Are you seeing a correlation with the crashes increasing because of distracted driving, just based on the behaviors that listeners of this podcast see and individuals all around the world see on a daily basis?
I think that sometimes it's probably hard to establish correlation, let alone causation, which is really what you care about when we are looking for, let's say, safety countermeasures. I think that we are all too aware of the too often misquoted 94% of human error. And so I don't necessarily want to go there. But what I'll tell you is when you look at distracted driving, when you look at things like fatigue, for example, those are symptoms. They are not necessarily a diagnosis. When you try to establish trends and statistics, like even NHTSA recognizes that it's really hard to pinpoint numbers and contributions. And so they can vary widely. Fatigue, I've seen reports that go for 2% and others that go for 20%, right? It's an active area of investigation. And I've seen actually ongoing research projects and proposals from the Transportation Research Board. I used to be a professor, so I keep receiving notifications and I keep track of all these massive grants and who's getting them. So it's a very active area of research still.
In your professional opinion, what causes fatigue driving? Is it overconfidence? Is it being overtired? Is it being stressed out about work? What causes fatigue driving?
So there's a nuance in your question that I like to highlight. You're asking what causes fatigue driving, and that can actually be decomposed in two questions. And I hope I'm not being too pedantic. The first one is what causes fatigue? And then the second one is what causes fatigue driving, right? So fatigue in and of itself is a natural state. Everybody experiences it. And although the community doesn't have a single definition that all the experts and scientists can agree upon, in general, everybody is okay saying that it's associated with a lack of sleep. And so more generally, there's poor sleep hygiene. Of course, stress, medical conditions can make that problem more acute. But the reality of what fatigue does to you is also very clear. It can impair your judgment. It can prevent appropriate mental state for driving. So this notion of an impaired decision making is exactly what you were getting at with potentially even the overconfidence and the fatigue driving. One of the stats that speaks the most to me was that recognition from the Harvard Medical School that 24 hours awake, which seems a lot, but could happen to anybody after one sleepless night, is akin to a blood alcohol level of 0.1, which is beyond the legal limit for driving. It's actually about double what is considered appropriate for flying an airplane. Beyond these effects of impairment, really, there's also the recognition that it's extremely hard, even for trained individuals, to self-detect fatigue. And so this is why I think it's a topic that we need to improve upon with education and just public speaking. There's a lot of discussions and debates and groups that discuss alcohol abuse and driving under the impairment from being drunk. And that is a deliberate behavior. Fatigue is a much more complex form of inattention, and there are experts in the field that have published for years, but I don't think that the realization has really sunk in yet for the community, at least the ADS community.
What you're describing is scary. If you think about it, an individual perhaps had 4 hours of sleep. They normally get 6 to 7 hours of sleep. What you described, they're going to be fatigued. That's really scary. You're formerly a professor. Now you're at Waymo, and you're really diving into fatigue. And you wrote a really wonderful paper called Waymo's Fatigue Risk Management Framework, Prevention, Monitoring, and Mitigation of Fatigue-Induced Risk While Testing Automated Driving Systems. I want to highlight this to listeners. The paper is well worth a read. It wasn't written like a professor. It was written something that was enjoyable, that you learned a lot. So Francesca, well done on the paper. I learned a lot from it. When you were researching the paper and actively working on it, was there something that you uncovered that you didn't know previously?
Yeah, how many hours do you have? So definitely there's a lot that was uncovered. There's a lot that I personally learned from that experience. Perhaps the first thing that I want to say is when you look at the co-authors of the paper, this was an incredibly cross-functional effort. I was not, and still I am not a fatigue expert. My role there was that of bringing the safety engineering rigor to the framework itself and really identifying all the different functions of countermeasures against fatigue-induced risks and what role they play within a more comprehensive and holistic framework. My co-authors were cognitive scientists, and so fatigue experts, UX experts, and so those looking at really at interfaces and how to best intervene on the autonomous specialist, the human. We had experts from operations, so those that on a daily basis deal with dispatching, supervising, checking on the autonomous specialists. And of course, we had the software engineers who were then responsible to understand the functionalities and translate that into code. So from each of these people, I learned a ton on the technical side of the actual technology, but also on the science. Some of the most fascinating stuff for me personally were finding connections to the aviation sector and the aviation realm, especially those that I had experienced myself. I joined Waymo at the beginning of 2020, which was the year after I had stopped doing my own pilot training, like to learn to fly an airplane. And I found so many connections with this notion that the FAA calls single crew resource management. Because when you're learning to fly and at some point you're flying solo, so there's nobody else in that tiny airplane with you, it's really up to you, like you're your own crew. And so you have these personal education, self-awareness, fitness for duty practices that you have to maintain to ensure that you can fly, that you're not too fatigued, and you have these checklists against over-reliance. We have this notion of invulnerability type of attitudes that the FAA really tries to educate young pilots against. And I was also teaching to young pilots. So that was something that finding the connections to ensuring appropriate awareness. So where you need to be at to be in a good position for supervising whatever function, in our case at Waymo, supervising an automated vehicle operating.
In the paper, you had this really great graphic for the autonomous specialists when you showed they arrive at work, they take their break, and you had the really great coffee emblem there. Perhaps it's a coffee break, and then they take their lunch break, and then they go home. Is that very similar for the FAA and for pilots for the fit for duty practices? Is that what that was modeled on?
The picture that you are specifically talking about was a picture that talks about the periodic fatigue surveys. And so those are surveys that autonomous specialists are invited to take before they embark on the vehicle. And that means at the beginning of the shift, but also after every break that they may take during the shift. As a general aviation pilot, when you are starting off in your career in aviation, no, there isn't something like that that is used. But there are other kinds of checklists, or at least not as automated as the ones that we are presenting in the paper and that Waymo uses. I remember, for example, my flight instructor taught me the I'm safe checklist, which basically means looking at status with respect to, and it's an acronym, illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotions against anger. And so those are things that for sure we drew upon as we were looking again at the functionalities that each of the 20 countermeasures that we list in the paper actually embodies.
It's truly amazing in the autonomous vehicle industry how much we're learning from the aviation industry. You just basically just barely scratched the surface, and we'll continue to learn from the aviation industry. When Waymo's out there in the public, in the cities that you're testing with automated autonomous specialists, what measures are put in place to eliminate potential fatigue to ensure that that vehicle is operating at the highest level of safety?
I want to step back for a second, and I hope I'm not being too pedantic, but the goal is not to eliminate fatigue, right? Because fatigue is a natural phenomenon. And so the fatigue risk management framework starts from the recognition that you cannot really eliminate it. And so the point is really managing fatigue-induced risks. And so we want to recognize the impact of those risks and prevent, whenever possible, those risks from materializing in the first place. And then if you cannot prevent them, then of course you resort to monitoring and mitigation. We list these 20 countermeasures in the paper and the three functions of prevention, monitoring, and mitigations. And they really are applied at multiple stages across a shift. So before, as we were mentioning before, the autonomous specialists get on board the vehicle while they're on board, and then post-drive, like after a shift ends, so that we ensure that we can have a lesson learned if anything happened that is noteworthy. This idea of prevention, monitoring, and mitigation across the entire shift is what led to the identification of 5 building blocks: the continued education, the awareness and reporting, the real-time vigilance assessment, the supplemental engagement, and the adaptive scheduling.
How is the framework developed? Was it that layered approach that you mentioned earlier around hardware, behavior, operations, but you're taking all the experts? You mentioned a UX expert, you had a fatigue expert, you had engineering experts, into putting it all together, this layered approach. So Waymo has this really in-depth, holistic approach of everything that could possibly cause potential fatigue?
The framework actually existed for a number of years, which is why we were confident in the usefulness of publishing it. And over the years, I think Waymo perfected a number of the methodologies and the countermeasures that are listed today. There are also a number of patents that were developed, and those are actually noted in the paper, especially on some of the interventions mechanisms, the in-car tasks or interactive cognitive tasks. And very early on, I think Waymo started with this notion of monitoring. I think that was very natural and intuitive for everybody. Waymo had done some consultation work with the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute to work more on this ORD scale, which is the observer rating of drowsiness, which was a scale that existed in theory, had some limitations, but had never been applied across a fleet in real time. And so the work started from there. But then when other people joined the fatigue, let's say, work group, what we brought together was the system safety thinking. And so this is where really the layers come together. When I did my PhD in safety engineering, one of the big notions that was really important for the research we were developing was this principle of defense in depth, or layers of defenses. It's known in different names in different industries. And the idea is that you're going to have multiple barriers, and so basic redundancy and achieving reliability because you have more than one countermeasures. But defense in depth goes deeper. It says, out of all these barriers, you want to look at them and you want to ensure that they have different functions. They shouldn't have a common cause failure. You cannot just rely on monitoring alone. You need to work on the prevention. You need to look at the intervention mechanisms to mitigate those risks. And so that's really where the entirety of the framework eventually came together. Once we packaged it, of course, it was also peer reviewed. This is a Waymo publication, if you will. So it's not an academic journal. And that's because of working for a private company, if you will. We're looking to expand the research itself. But after we were done, we had a number of world-renowned experts that were reviewing the work.
For a listener that's sitting here and says, this is fascinating, I want to follow Grayson's lead and read the paper, where can they go and download and read the paper?
It's at waymo.com/safety. And there's 6 other papers together with this one that I encourage your audience to really dive into. They are all amazing.
Again, as Francesca said, it's waymo.com/safety. It's really well done. I highly recommend that you read it. I want to get into the common cause failure. That was really interesting. As you're developing this framework, are you looking at all these different scenarios and trying to find patterns? Perhaps we can try and do this, and then if this happens, is that what you're trying to do? Basically, if you're building an autonomous vehicle from a hardware standpoint, you're putting multiple levels of redundancy in. Is that very similar to the approach with a common cause failure approach?
Yeah, so the notion of common cause failure is really a safety principle. You can abstract it, and it applies to whatever type of technology or system you're designing. That's something that my late advisor was very keen on, finding those principles that can guide engineering practices regardless of what system you're applying them to. In my PhD, I did nuclear reactors, I did power plants of other kinds, I did airplanes, and it was using the same philosophy for all of them. So when we're looking at a common cause failure, we're really looking at a way to diversify the type of safety countermeasures. So I want to give you a few examples because this is going to become way too theoretical way too soon. So when you look at the monitoring piece, which is perhaps, again, the most intuitive, everybody understands what monitoring means. But how does appropriate safety engineering rigor apply to something like monitoring? Well, the first thing that you do is, this is common to many other manufacturers as well, they will use more than one camera. We add redundancy, and so maybe you have 2 cameras, one that looks at the front, one that looks at the top. And so that allows you to do automated monitoring for eye tracking, head position, gaze fixation, and whatnot in a more robust way. Okay, that's one step. Then the second step is, hey, guess what? I'm going to do automated monitoring through those cameras that have an algorithm to check for eye tracking, closures, and whatnot. And I'm going to complement that with human remote operated monitoring so that anytime the automated monitoring flags something, a human rater is also going to observe the scene. And by the way, also at random times, that human rater can pop in and take a look to evaluate what's happening in the vehicle. And so this is, again, a way of diversifying and adding another layer, combining automated and human-based. And that's not enough. I can actually have 3 different human raters and check cross-validation reliability. If one is assigning a low fatigue and one is assigning a high fatigue, who's right? That's hard to say. And this is when you want to have more than one, and you want to have them appropriately trained. You want them to undergo assessments and tests to verify that they can provide consistent type of assessments. And even that is not enough. This is what we call direct monitoring, but we add indirect monitoring on top of the direct monitoring. Direct monitoring means looking at your eyes, looking at your posture, looking at your head. Indirect monitoring means looking at the type of activities and interaction that you're having with the environment that surrounds you. So the interactive car tasks, or ICT in the paper, they look at how frequently or maybe for how long the autonomous specialist has not really interacted with the environment that's in the vehicle. They have not maybe pressed one of the buttons that they can voluntarily press to indicate the Waymo driver is doing good or is doing bad. Maybe they haven't been releasing vocal comments. They can, during their missions, give us feedback on how good we're doing, or maybe things that did not work as they would have expected. And so people investigate those. When they are not interacting with the vehicle, there's the potential for monotony. There's this potential for complacency. And so we want to get them stimulated on a cognitive level. That's why we have the supplemental engagement that uses indirect monitoring to ensure that autonomous specialists can be brought back into the loop and retain appropriate situational awareness. So this is just an example of how defensing that, which is a very theoretical but simple type of safety principle, gets implemented in a rigorous and systematic framework for mitigating fatigue-induced risks in this case.
I'll sum it up this way. Waymo's the real deal. That was really impressive. If I'm a law enforcement official, I'm a first responder, I'm a local elected official, what you described to me, you're building confidence as you're going to deploy these vehicles in my local community and interact with the residents of the community. What you described is absolute confidence. Is the framework shared with those individuals as Waymo expands into new cities, into new communities?
Actually, that was one of the use cases that prompted us to publish an in-depth presentation of all of the elements. We had shared portions of this paper for things like permit applications, insurance stipulations, and the like. But this is the first time that we are really releasing the details about the entirety of the framework.
To me, you're mitigating risk. You mentioned insurance. I'm an insurance geek. You're mitigating risk on that front. What you've described was brilliant. Waymo has, as we said earlier, the culture of safety. Do you just view this as another layered approach to complementing that culture of safety that's been developed and actively practiced inside of Waymo?
For sure. And I think this speaks to the fact that we are being deliberate about safety. Safety doesn't happen overnight. And so you have to be intentional in creating the appropriate safety culture. And this is explained in the paper. There's really effort placed in empowering employees to speak up, sharing lessons learned, soliciting feedback. I think that publishing this paper is a testament to that.
It's a testament to that, but it's a testament to transparency. I want to repeat that. It's a testament to transparency. Without transparency, without trust, we don't have autonomous vehicles. This is a really great step for Waymo to build that trust with the public. Is that one of the key elements that as Waymo's developing, you're developing the safety and you're doing a brilliant job, is building and maintaining trust with the public?
Yeah, and we touched upon this a little bit before. I think that Waymo always took good care in ensuring that what we were doing with regards to safety wouldn't be a secret. Waymo was the first to release the voluntary self-safety assessment, the VSSA. And definitely what we did in 2020, so the release of the overview of all of the methodologies that we use for that estimation that the Waymo Driver is ready to go fully autonomous on public roads, that was another big step. And we complemented it with publishing the collection of crash data for all fully autonomous miles that we had. And that was both the actual crashes that we've seen on the roads, but also the counterfactual crashes. Nowadays, everybody's required to report crashes. And so there are public websites and NHTSA provides all that data publicly. But adding to that the counterfactual simulated crashes and doing it 2 years before that was a regulatory requirement, I think that really speaks to our commitment to safety.
It speaks to transparency and leadership. There's no other way to say it. It's transparency and leadership. And Waymo has, going back to the early days, has made a commitment to SAE Level 4. And I want to read the conclusion of the fatigue risk management framework paper here, because the following is stated. I think this is really important for the listeners to hear. Our early testing and substantial body of literature indicated that any human, even those trained and specially told to continuously monitor the operations of the ADS, can be subject to the complacency and altered state of attention, i.e. distracted, drowsy, or otherwise impaired, that can hinder the safety of the overall endeavor. There's been hints throughout the years, but I want to ask you very bluntly, is this why Waymo focused on the level 4 system, because what was described there in the conclusion of the paper?
Absolutely. It starts with this realization of the notion of irony of automation, which is a staple in human factors. It's recognized across automotive, aviation, chemical power plants, and whatnot. And Google became keenly aware of this paradox in its early testing in 2012 and 2013. Roughly or simply speaking, the irony of automation is a paradox that states that the better a system becomes, the harder it becomes for a human who is overseeing that technology to pay appropriate attention and remain in the loop. And when you apply that to driving, of course, that becomes a problem, because if a human driver, regardless of whether it's a trained for that job autonomous specialist or a normal customer, the less attention they can pay to the traffic and to the system translate in a lower capability to be able to resume control effectively. And so you've probably seen the videos on YouTube and TED Talks from way back in the day of employees that were supposed to monitor the technology and do testing, and they were rummaging for cables, doing makeup, or even sleeping. I think that what that made for Google was this realization that there was going to be over-reliance regardless of the level of autonomy. What we were testing back then was a system, probably a level one. I'm not entirely sure because I wasn't with Google back then, but it was in lane only longitudinal motion control. And I think that, again, this notion of irony automation led to the realization that the most effective way to overcome all these risks that are induced by human factors was to go for level 4 technology.
It's the only way forward. Level 4 system does not get distracted. It doesn't get drowsy. It doesn't get impaired. And it doesn't have emotions. It's not worried about getting to death. Oh, I got to get there faster. Well, I have to beat that red light. Wait a second. If I go a little bit faster, I can beat that red light. The level 4, as in your case, the Waymo driver is focused on getting the passenger or the goods from the point A to point B safely and efficiently. And that's all its focus is doing. The Waymo driver has come a long way. I like to use the term baseball analogies. We're getting ready to go into the playoffs here. In my opinion, the Waymo driver is only in inning 1 of a 9-inning game of where the technology is going to go and ultimately get. How do you see the Waymo driver evolving over the coming years? Because the company's made incredible progress to date.
I think I really like your analogy and I agree with you. To me, the vast majority of progress and the future outlook is going to be about scale and about expansion. And this is why autonomous specialists and something like the fatigue risk management program are so important. Autonomous specialists have a key role as we enable more functionalities for the Waymo driver. So say that we want to start enabling faster speeds or longer stretches of highway environments. Autonomous specialists will play a fundamental role for responsible testing of the technology. But also as we expand to new cities, say that we want to go and have data collection in New York, you might have seen the news a few months back, they will remain a staple of responsible testing. And we talked about our expansion playbook before, but that's what I like about Waymo. There's ambition, but there's also realism about what it takes to progress. And so being in the lower innings, yes, we have still a long way to go. But I think we are at a point where we have a proof of concept. The technology can work, and now it's about enabling scalability.
You're past the proof of concept stage. It's working. You're doing a great job. You see the videos from Chandler, the individuals going to the park with their children, their smiles on their faces. The technology is working. You are responsible for testing. I like your layered approach that you described earlier. That's an approach that you do sit on standards committee. It should be standard across the board. Every company working on this should have that layered safety approach because you're doing a really good job on it. You're sitting in the nexus of an incredible company, Waymo, that's developing the future. You're developing autonomous vehicles. In your opinion, what does the future look like for autonomous vehicles?
That's a great question. And I'm going to answer on a personal level. So I'm going to remove my Waymo hat for a second. I think that short term will probably hit recession in the post-pandemic world, which means that this is the time for more heads down work, more good, solid technical work. And so I'm excited to get that work and hopefully publish it. But that might also mean changes for the industry. We might see consolidation of players because of that recession. However, when we look longer term, I have no doubt that this is going to revolutionize how we conceive transportation, period.
It's going to change everything. The Bloomberg Recession Index is currently at 50%. And yes, I think we are going into recession. And yes, there is consolidation coming, but consolidation is healthy in markets. And what you and the team at Waymo are building is the future. It will have a positive impact on millions of lives around the world. And I can't wait to the day that the Waymo vehicles will pull in front of my house and I can hop in with my daughter and we can go to school and I can drop her off. And that's a day that's going to put a smile on my face. And that's a day that you're getting pretty close to. So please come down to Palm Beach because we'd love to have Waymo here. So that's my little plug. And Francesca, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them? I learned a lot about safety. I learned a lot about fatigue, so I thank you for that. But what would you like the listeners to take away with them today?
I think that what I would like to maybe remark again is that fatigue and general inattention touch everyone. And so the irony of automation paradox applies to any level of autonomy. And our research is showing that you need a deliberate and comprehensive approach that goes beyond simple monitoring. The public should care, whether it is because level 4 technology is being tested on public roads or because the cars that they are buying may embed technologies that can expose to them to new types of risks that they are not even aware of, they should care. And so my hope is that this paper will be discussed, it will be built upon to ensure that we can continue to further the conversation about transportation safety. And that's both with the public and with the industry.
And what we need, and this is clearly documented in your paper, we need a layered approach to safety. Because the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is Waymo. Francesca, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
It was awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter @Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.